Welcome to this presentation on the Bible and sex, some yeses and some nos, which is presented by me, David Carr, professor of Old Testament Hebrew Bible at Union Theological Seminary in New York, and author of The Erotic Word, Sexuality, Spirituality, and the Bible. Much of the following presentation on the Bible and sex is based on that book, The Erotic Word, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2003. But in the meantime, Erdman's published in 2012 an excellent book by William Loader on the New Testament and sexuality. And these two books form the basis for what follows on the Bible and sex. Often when I talk with classes or other groups about sex in the Bible, I start with an association exercise. I ask them, what's the first word you think of when you hear the words sex and Bible? I've talked to a whole lot of different groups, but I hear some common terms every time. No. Shame. Thou shalt not. Don't covet. And so on. My aims in this presentation are threefold. I want to counter this dominant no to sex that people hear in the Bible with a prior and overarching biblical yes to erotic connection. I want to outline more specifically the ancient context of the no's that we find in the Bible. And I want to consider the potential ongoing relevance of some parts of the Bible's message on sexuality. I should note in advance that for many people, this review of texts, so often used to judge and condemn people for their love, can be painful. There's no easy way to move through these passages, and the middle part of this presentation on the no's in the Bible may be particularly difficult for some. But I think it's important to have a clear view of the problem passages and at least a brief sense of their context. You can take your time with this, take care of yourself, and we can process. My first main point is that the Bible does not begin with a no, but with two yeses to sex in the creation stories with which Genesis begins. We start with the words in Genesis 1 that start with a decisive affirmation of the creation of humanity, both males and females, in the bodily, physical likeness of God. Let us make humanity in our own image, in the likeness of ourselves, God says. And then God created humanity in the image of God's self. In the image of God, God created humanity, male and female, God created them. It is as if the writer was saying, God made you, embodied you in God's image and likeness. Did I mention you're an image of God? By the way, God created you, whether male or female, in God's own bodily image. And if there was a doubt about whether this meant God created humans in godlike bodies to be sexual, the text goes on to say next that God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply. Within the ancient world of the Bible, which was an agricultural world focused on producing big families in order to survive, there could be no clearer affirmation of sex. Yet already here, we see how even the Bible's yes to sex is conditioned by its ancient cultural context. As if to nuance and emphasize the point, the Bible does not leave the yes to Genesis 1. Instead, it returns to this topic in describing human creation in more detail in Genesis chapter 2. This starts when God creates the human from the ground and breathes God's breath into the human to make that human live. This is when God says, "It is not right that this human should be alone. I shall make this human a helper." And when God makes a woman out of a part of the first human, he sings a song of celebration about their common flesh. He says, "This one at last, flesh of my flesh, she is to be called woman because she was taken from man." And this is when the story goes on to say that their common origin is why people from the beginning of time have become attached to each other and become one flesh. Much more could be said about this chapter, some of which is already covered in a chapter in my book, The Erotic Word. The main point I'd stress here is that there is no emphasis in this biblical yes to sexuality on being fruitful and multiplying. Instead, the focus is on God's wish for human companionship and partnership. God says it is not good for the human to be alone, and God creates another human, one who's this first human's equal, and then made from one flesh, the first two humans long to be reconnected with each other. That is the human destiny at the beginning of the Bible, for partnership, bodily connection with an equal. It is a decisive yes to sex, and indeed non-reproductive sex. Yes, to be sure, it still focuses on men and women, but it is as close as one could come in antiquity to a yes to bodily connection that did not involve children. According to this text, God wished from the outset that humans should not be alone. God wished from the beginning that humans would have a fully equal partner to share work with. Humans were created for such bodily connection irrespective of whether children might result. Of course, the story does go on to describe sex as part of having children. But this comes only after the eating of the forbidden fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It is a tragic outgrowth of this that God pronounces in saying to the woman, I shall multiply your toil and conception of children. With toil you shall give birth to children, and your desire will be for your husband, and he will dominate you. Many in past history have assumed that God here is saying that it's good for men to rule women. But noted Union professor Phyllis Tribble pointed out that this pronouncement of male rule only comes as a tragic outgrowth of the eating of the fruit. The Garden of Eden story says a decisive yes to connect sex between equals. But it also recognizes the reality of a torn ancient world where men did rule women and women were subject to constant childbirth. The focus on the tragedy and pain of aspects of married sex is yet another way that the Bible reflects its ancient cultural context. This discussion of patriarchy and childbirth takes us into the biblical no's that have so dominated people's perception of the Bible's message. And I start with the often discussed biblical perspective on sex between men and between women, same-sex loving. Now here I am not thinking of one of the most famous texts often referred to in relation to homosexuality, and that is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis chapter 19. Though this story often is seen as a condemnation of male-male sex, it's far more a story of Sodom and Gomorrah's lack of hospitality, when the men of the town threatened to rape the angels who were staying there as Lot's guests. No, to get to the Bible's actual condemnation of same-sex loving, it's found in chapters 18 and 20 of Leviticus, and then later in Paul's letters. Here the emphasis is clearly on male-male intercourse, and not on any other type of sexuality. Both Leviticus 18:22 and 20 verse 13 stress a prohibition of a man lying down with another man, the lying down of a woman. Most scholars agree that the focus here is on male-male intercourse, the lying down like the lying down of a woman. And the issue here is primarily one of a perception that a man having intercourse with another man turns that man through penetration into a woman. It is a fundamental violation of honor rules requiring punishment by death. This biblical no to male-male intercourse is part of an ancient system of gender and honor. And insofar as contemporary people reject such simple systems of gender hierarchy and honor codes, they should disregard this biblical prohibition as well. In any case, we should also note that there is no general prohibition in the Hebrew Bible anywhere of same-sex loving in the Old Testament. Nothing against oral sex, kissing by men, nothing about any sex at all between women. There is just this prohibition in Leviticus on penalty of death of male-male intercourse, which is grounded in outmoded ancient ideas about honor and the hierarchy of the sexes. Also, in the New Testament, we should mention there is not a word, not one, about same-sex loving quoted by Jesus. But we do have some major statements by Paul. Take, for example, this typical Hellenistic condemnation by Paul of men who have sex with other men. Both those who exploit other men, arsenokoitai, and the soft ones, malakoi, who willingly participate in being so exploited. This is Paul's specifically Greek version of the honor gender-based prohibition of same-sex loving seen in the Hebrew Bible. And Paul's prohibition is equally rooted in the culture of Paul's time. For more discussion of this passage, and good links to prior scholarship by Dale Martin of Yale University and others on these issues, see William Loader's excellent book on the New Testament and Sexuality mentioned at the outset of this presentation. Now, unique to Paul in the Bible is his condemnation of female-female loving found in chapter 1 of Romans. He says, "That is why God abandoned them," that is the Gentiles, "to degrading passions, why their women have exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural practices, and the men in similar fashion too, giving up normal relations with women, are consumed with passion for each other." This caricature of female-female sex, if that in fact is what Paul means, as unnatural, has to do with Paul's broader hostility towards sex that I'll discuss shortly. But I'll note here as well how Paul goes on in chapter 2, verse 1, to condemn all in his audience who would judge others. This is a point often overlooked by people who use this passage in Romans from Paul to condemn same-sex loving by others. There are, of course, other biblical no's to other types of sex. Another chief type is adultery, which is condemned in both the Old and New Testaments. But here again, the Bible turns out to be advocating norms that would be quite foreign to most people now. This is not clear, of course, if you just look at the 10 Commandments, which command, "Do not commit adultery." But when we look closer, it turns out this adultery is something quite specific. It is when a man has intercourse with another man's wife, as in Leviticus 18:20 shown here. "You will not have intercourse with your fellow citizen's wife." Or Leviticus 20 verse 10. "The man who commits adultery with his neighbor's wife will be put to death." Or Deuteronomy 22 verse 22. "If a man is caught having intercourse with another man's wife, both will be put to death." In biblical law, married men could have sex with unmarried women. That is, virgins not yet married, slaves, prisoners, widows. And it wasn't counted as adultery, although the man would have to pay a bride price for the virgin to her father. The one thing that is forbidden is to violate another man's right to his wife by having sex with her. If that is done, both the wife and the man who had sex with her were to be put to death. This perspective is even found in the saying in Matthew about lust in the heart for a married woman. "You have heard it said, 'You shall not commit adultery,'" Jesus is quoted as saying. "But I say this to you, if a man looks at a married woman lustfully, he has already committed adultery with her in his heart." The injunction against adultery here is directed at men, and the point is to get them to stop lusting after other man's wives. So, there is a double standard in the Bible. Let's just say that clearly. Married women who have sex outside of marriage with any man are put to death. And married men who have sex with a woman outside of marriage are fine, as long as that woman is not married to another man. Bill Clinton would have done a lot better in this sort of system, which is still somewhat informally operative among some groups and individuals today. But many assume Clinton violated biblical rules for adultery, biblical family values. He did not, since Monica Lewinsky and other women he was accused of having sex with were not married. The way this double standard works is made particularly clear in Proverbs chapter 6, verse 26, which urges young men to be sure to patronize prostitutes before risking adultery with a married woman. The cost of a prostitute, the verse says, is a loaf of bread. But sex with a married woman risked death at the hands of her jealous husband. Again, the no's of ancient Israel are thoroughly rooted in the ancient gender rules of Israelite culture, rules that protected a married man's power over his wife's sexuality and reproduction. There's another biblical no that's specific to the New Testament, and indeed possibly traceable to Jesus himself, and it's the biblical no to divorce. In the Old Testament, it should be noted, divorce is allowed. Deuteronomy 24 allows a man to write a, quote, writ of divorce and send his wife away from him and his home. The text even envisions that this woman might be subject to such divorce twice, and it forbids her first husband to take her back. The New Testament presents a more restrictive attitude toward divorce, starting with our earliest datable reference, which is Paul's statement in 1 Corinthians 7:10-11, that he has a saying of the Lord against divorce. The Greek of this saying literally refers to separating from and dismissing. But the context of the chapter, Paul's discussion of marriage, makes clear that he means divorce. To the married I give this ruling, and it is not mine but the Lord's. A wife must not be separated, that is divorced, from her husband. Or if she's already divorced him, she must remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, and a husband must not divorce his wife. It is quite rare for Paul to cite a Jesus saying, and this is one of the few times he does so. It is our earliest attested reference to Jesus forbidding divorce, earlier even than the Gospels, which were actually written a few decades after the Apostle Paul's letters. We also have some references in the New Testament Gospels to the same tradition, and indeed in both of the major sources of the Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke. The first example comes from the Q saying source of material shared by Matthew and Luke. But this saying diverges on a crucial point. Where the Luke version conforms to the typical Old Testament law forbidding remarriage after divorce, Matthew's version has Jesus forbidding divorce more generally, except in the case of sexual immorality. He says, and this takes us to the Markan tradition about Jesus' saying on divorce, found in Mark 10, verses 2-9, and then picked up in Matthew chapter 19, verses 3-9. And this latter Matthean version adds an exception at the end for divorce because of sexual immorality. In this striking saying, Jesus bases a prohibition of divorce on the Garden of Eden story that we talked about earlier, and he quotes Genesis 2:24 in particular. He says, so then, what God has united, human beings must not divide. The idea is that when two people become one flesh, something so profound happens, almost mystical, that they shouldn't be separated again. We don't even find in this version of the saying the exception of sexual immorality, found in Matthew's version of the Q saying. This text has caused much harm among unhappily married couples, or even couples where there are issues of domestic abuse, and it still does. And it does not do to try to make this text look good by suggesting that this saying by Jesus opposes some awful practice of divorce among the Jews of Jesus' time. That strategy of making the New Testament Jesus look good by making the Judaism of Jesus' time look bad is both academically and ethically questionable. Instead, we need to confront here another place where the Bible's rule about sex, including a rule that's multiply attested from Jesus in Paul, Q, and Mark, does not agree with those held by many today. And acknowledging the damage this and other Jesus prohibitions of divorce have caused, we might also recognize the potential power of his affirmation of erotic connectedness in the Garden of Eden in this story in Mark 10. For Jesus as well, it is not good for a human to be alone. For Jesus of Mark 10, the Eden version of erotic connectedness is the primary ideal. What God has united, human beings must not divide, Jesus in this saying says. Might that not also apply to people joined in erotic connection outside the male-female relationship presupposed by these ancient texts? So, I've gone over several biblical no's about sexuality against male-male intercourse and exploitation, with an additional caricature of same-sex loving by men and women in Romans 1. The prohibition within a double standard of men having sex with other men's wives, the biblical idea of adultery. And the general prohibition of divorce, found in a very early Jesus tradition, possibly rooted in a strong reading of the Garden of Eden story as depicting the eternal connection produced when people become one flesh. And the list doesn't stop there. There are biblical prohibitions of bestiality, incest, sex with a woman during her menstrual period, even a possible Jesus condemnation, unique to the Gospel of Mark, of the pedestry, male exploitation of children that was relatively common in the Hellenistic world. Jesus in this saying says, anyone who causes one of these little ones, micron in Greek, who have faith to stumble, would be better thrown into the sea with a great millstone hung around his neck. Many of these no's, some of which we might agree with, but perhaps it's no wonder that people often associate the word no with the words Bible and sex. But things get yet worse, or intense, might say, in terms of no's to sexuality if we move to the New Testament and its generally hostile attitude towards sex in general, including sex between married men and women. We see this most clearly in Paul, who tells the church at Corinth that it's best for a man not to touch a woman. Those who marry will be distressed in the flesh and have their interests divided. So, for Paul, it is best only to marry if you will burn with lust otherwise, and even when married, to avoid sex as much as possible. Speaking to churches in Galatia, Paul urged them to just live by the Spirit and not gratify the desires of the flesh. Similar attitudes led later authors of the New Testament Gospels to depict Jesus as a single man who anticipates a kingdom of heaven where people will neither marry nor be given in marriage, and even make themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. We have no way of knowing if Jesus, like most Jewish men of his time, was actually married, but we do know that the movement who followed Jesus idealized those who had no sex at all, and they saw Jesus as an image of such a sexless life. For early members of the Jesus movement, sex was a luxury that could be sacrificed as they awaited Jesus' second coming. They were living in an end time when cultivating freedom from passion was crucial for preparing for God's reversal of all things familiar. So, is everything time-bound in the Bible? Does it have nothing of lasting value? I would argue that it does. A first example would be the ideal, already in Genesis 2, of sex between equals, of finding a partner corresponding to one, with whom one can no longer be alone and be one flesh. This emphasis in Genesis 2 on non-reproductive sex between equals could even, I believe, be taken as an implicit potential endorsement of same-sex loving. It doesn't need to become a law that then is used to oppress single people, telling them that they're doing something wrong by not hooking up with somebody permanently. But this affirmation, I think, has evocative potential to affirm a whole range of different kinds of ways that people find themselves in loving, committed, equal relationships with people who correspond to them. Then there are the prohibitions of incest, found in Leviticus 18 and 20. Universal rules protecting the safety of the family, not limited to Christianity or Judaism. But they remain significant boundaries that suggest that not anything goes. Or, for example, the subtle prohibition of pederasty in Mark 9:42 against the exploitation of young boys. And finally, there's the enigmatic refrain found in the Song of Songs to not awaken love until she's ready. This starts in chapter 2, verse 7, and echoes multiple times throughout the book, marking the major sections of the Song of Songs. Now, scholars debate about the translation of this crucial phrase. Is it, don't disturb the lovers before they're ready? Or is it, don't arouse love before her time? I'm inclined toward the wisdom of the latter. especially within our culture where sex can be commodified and the people connected to it. The potential power of erotic love can be forgotten. The repeated urgings in the song not to awaken love too early remind us of love's power and urge care in awakening and cultivating it. There is an important wisdom in this call that's all too easily forgotten, especially in a society where sex and people's bodies are too easily commodified, turned into goods, bought and sold, whether literally with money or with other things. So what's the takeaway from all this? I can't say for you, but looking back, I just emphasize 3 overall points. First of all, the Bible's yes to embodied erotic connection between equals, including a yes to sex that isn't immediately connected to having children. Also, the Bible's often culture-bound no's. No's to things thought to be important in its context. No to men having intercourse with other men, especially in exploitive situations. No to men having sex with other men's women. No to divorce in the New Testament. And in the end-time atmosphere of early Christianity, a general no, or at least discouragement of sex in general. And finally, the Bible's potential ongoing relevance in urging certain kinds of wisdom around the power of sex, especially in a cultural context where sex and people's bodies can be commodified. So, this is an initial overview, but if you'd like to learn more, I hope you'll explore my book, The Erotic Word, Sexuality, Spirituality, and the Bible, which provides a new take on the Bible's overall perspective on sexuality, one that emphasizes the Bible's yes and places its no's in context. In addition, on a completely different topic, Yale University Press published in 2014 my most recent book, Holy Resilience, The Bible's Traumatic Origins, which tells the story of the formation of the Old and New Testaments amidst the crucible of communal trauma. Thank you for listening.